Welcome to the Carmel Foundation Virtual Wednesday program. I'm David Laws, and I'm going to talk about an interesting period in the time of Monterey and the local area. I originally planned to write an article on the various activities and programs planned by the city of Monterey for the 250th birthday, I think in May of this year. Obviously that didn't work out, so I came up with the idea of a virtual visit to some of my favorite spots. I do have modern photographs of pretty all of these sites, but thought it might be interesting to illustrate the text with postcard views published over the last 100 years or so. So Monterey, California planned a big celebration on June the 3rd, 2020, of the 250th anniversary of the founding of the city in 1770. Sadly, all birthday events from historical reenactments to block parties and patriotic parades were canceled or postponed due to the great COVID-19 pandemic. And instead, otherworldly masked figures haunt the streets of Old Monterey, and the venerable adobes are silent and shuttered. We cannot visit them in person, so I invite you to join me on a virtual tour of some of my favorite spots. Monterey is proud of its role as the capital of Spanish and later Mexican California. With more than 40 properties from that era on the historical inventory list, 10 of them within the Monterey State Historic Park District, the city claims to have preserved more such buildings than anywhere else in the state. Monterey is also the only place in North America to have lived under the flags of 4 colonial powers. I'll start with a brief history of Monterey to give some background on the individual locations on the tour. Then we'll explore half a dozen places downtown, spots chosen for their visual appeal, historic importance, and the fascinating characters that continue to haunt them. After that, we'll climb a hill where many of the stories of California's transition from an ancient community of native people through successive occupations by the Spanish crown, the Argentine Navy, the forces of Mexico, and finally the annexation of the United States took place. So my first picture here, this isn't actually a postcard picture, but it's a photograph of a mural which is on the wall overlooking the harbor in Monterey of the Vizcaino Oak by muralist Stephanie Rosso, and is an image of the site where the city of Monterey was founded. But Esalen and Rumsian speaking people lived on the Monterey Peninsula for thousands of years before maritime explorer Sebastian Vizcaino arrived in 1602 to claim the land for Spain. He described the site as having an ancient live oak tree, and that's the main object that we see in the mural here. In 1770, Gaspar de Portola led an expedition overland from San Diego to establish a mission and a fortified military settlement that we call a presidio at a site near the Vizcaino Oak. Franciscan Father Junipero Serra arrived by sea on June the 3rd, 1770, conducted a religious service to mark the founding of the colonial outpost of Monterey. A hastily constructed adobe wall presidio compound housed the mixed military and religious community until 1 year later, Serra led his followers over the hill to greener pastures overlooking Carmel Bay. And then in 1776, Juan Sebastian de Anza traveled from Sonora, Mexico, leading the first civilian colonists and Spanish authorities, named the Pueblo de Monterey as the administrative capital of California. After Mexico declared independence from Spain in 1822, Monterey became a port of entry to the province of California. And as described by Richard Henry Dana in 2 years before the mast, British and American ships trading in tallow and leather drove early commercial exploitation of the area. And then during the Mexican-American War in 1846, commander of the Pacific Squadron, Commodore John Sloat, seized Monterey and declared the land as part of the United States. In 1849, delegates from across California gathered in Colton Hall to write a Constitution document. 1 year later, Congress voted to admit California as the 31st state of the Union. Monterey went on to contribute many firsts in the development of the Golden State, including the first newspaper, public library, secondary school, theater, and military base. The modern economy began with fishing and tourism. Both blossomed into important industries in the late 19th century. We will begin our tour at the Royal Presidio Chapel and make our way downhill to the shore of Monterey Bay. Accompanying illustrations are from postcards mailed by visitors to these same spots over 100 years ago. So this first picture of the Royal Presidio Chapel, also known today as San Carlos Cathedral, it's California Historical Landmark number 105 and is located on Church Street in Monterey. And the postcard picture here was printed about 1914. It's actually called Mission San Carlos, although the Mission San Carlos moved to Carmel in 1771, and this chapel building opened in 1774. But we're standing on a wide paved plaza surrounding the Royal Presidio Chapel. This solid sandstone building, the oldest in Monterey, is the only surviving structure from inside the long fallen walls of the original Presidio compound. After secularization of the missions in 1843, the chapel became the parish church of the community until designated as San Carlos Cathedral in 1850. Designed by the Academy of San Carlos in Mexico City and constructed by Native American labor in 1794, the chapel is the most elaborate of all Spanish-era buildings in California. A square, two-story, conical, tiled roof bell tower on the northeast corner flanks an ornate Moorish-influenced facade embellished with decorative niches, pilasters, and scrollwork. The oldest non-indigenous sculpted image of California, a bas-relief rendering of Our Lady of Guadalupe, is mounted just below the apex of the broken pediment ornamental arch. Massive wooden doors swing open to usher congregants into a classic high-ceilinged basilica-style nave. Transepts added in 1858 yielded the present cross-shaped design. A lattice pattern interspersed with bunches of grapes is painted on the walls in the rich gold, green, and red colors of Spain. Clear panels mounted in the wall expose sections of a monochromatic gray version from the Mexican era. Other religious decoration includes canvas artwork of the Stations of the Cross and several 18th century carved and painted wooden figures. But today the doors are locked, the building is silent. I recall happier times attending glorious Bach Festival twilight chamber concerts of Baroque music performed on period instruments. But distant barking intrudes into my reverie. The scene where the pirates' 5 dogs caused chaos in the cathedral in John Steinbeck's Tortilla Flat springs to mind. Before leaving the plaza, I peer through darkened windows into the adjacent Royal Presidio Chapel Heritage Center. Exhibits hidden in the shadows include remnants of the ancient live oak under which Serra conducted Monterey's founding ceremony, together with pottery shards, tools, a Spanish-era coin, and other memorabilia uncovered during archaeological investigation of the site. In 1905, a young Japanese fisherman, Ichio Noda, crafted 3 mission-style chairs from branches of that Serra oak. One remaining chair is on exhibit in the Japanese American Citizens League Heritage Center in Monterey. So after less than a 5-minute stroll, we arrive at the French Hotel, also known as the Robert Louis Stevenson House. So this is California Historic Landmark number 352, located on Houston Street here in town. And the postcard here dates from somewhere around the 1930s. Here, the lovesick, almost penniless 29-year-old Scottish author lived for 3 months in 1879 while in pursuit of Fanny Osborne. He met Fanny in France 4 years earlier, where, estranged from her adulterous husband, she was studying art. The tale of RLS's brief sojourn in this 2-story stone and adobe rooming house is the stuff of legend. While awaiting Fanny's divorce, they married in San Francisco in 1880. Friendly locals raised money to help feed the starving writer. In his tiny upstairs room, RLS wrote Notes for the Amateur Emigrant, a book on his journey across the country, and several essays, including The Old Pacific Capital, that describe his adventures on the Monterey Peninsula. These include starting a forest fire in Pacific Grove, falling ill in Carmel Valley, where he was nursed back to health by goat ranchers, and exploring the rugged shores of Point Lobos, claimed by some as the inspiration for landscape features in his famous novel, Treasure Island. Today, the building houses an extensive collection of Stevensonia that in better times is open for public viewing. I peered through a hole in the gate into the rear walled garden. It's tempting to imagine the winding paths and densely planted beds of cineraria, foxgloves, and poppies as the park-like setting for Steinbeck's short story, How Edith McGillicuddy Met RLS. But in reality, when Stevenson lived here, the yard was a barren, dry patch of weeds. Less than a 3-minute walk brings us to our next stop. So our next stop here is the Cooper Molera adobe. It's a National Trust historic site located on 560 Monroe Avenue here in Monterey. The picture I'm showing here is not of the adobe. It's a picture of Signora Bonifacio and the Sherman Rose that was printed on a postcard about 1916. And I will tell you why I've chosen that picture as we proceed here. American Captain John Rogers Cooper arrived in Monterey in 1823. He married Encarnacion, the sister of Mexican General Mariano Vallejo, and became a Mexican citizen in order to own property. Over many years and changes of ownership, the walled 2-acre Cooper Molera property eventually comprised 2 adjoining adobe houses, several barns, a cookhouse, and a warehouse. The National Trust for Historic Preservation partnered with commercial interests to restore the complex for a museum and compatible real estate event uses. Opened in 2019, the museum exhibits period furniture, paintings, and an archaeology room with the floor removed to expose its stone foundation. As an essential business, the Alta Bakery and Cafe, occupying the single-story adobe, continues throughout today's strange times. The garden includes a small orchard with almond trees propagated from cuttings from the site, together with fig, pear, walnut, and several apple varieties that would have been available in Cooper's time. Chromatella, a climbing tea noisette rose, grows against the orchard wall. Also known as the Sherman rose, this pale yellow bloom is associated with a popular legend of the late 1800s that thrived for decades. General William Tecumseh Sherman served as a lieutenant in Monterey from 1846 to 1847. He billeted at our next stop. The young lieutenant is said to have presented a cutting of the rose to the beautiful Senorita Maria Ignacia Bonifacio and promised to return to wed her by the time it rooted and bloomed. But the first cuttings of the rose, then known as cloth of gold, did not arrive in Monterey for more than 25 years after Sherman left. But fueled by an energetic promoter, the fable drove a bloom in yellow roses and quaint tea rooms. Bonifacio's black-clothed presence and rose-covered arbor outside her home on Alvarado Street became a tourist landmark of such note that in the early 1920s, artist Percy Gray transplanted the rose and moved the house brick by brick to a new site on the Monterey Mesa a couple of miles away. Our next stop at the Larkin House and Sherman Quarters is California Historical Landmark number 106 and is at 464 Calle Principal in Monterey. The postcard itself dates probably from around 1925. There's something about a locked gate and a high stone wall that makes the secret garden all the more intriguing. Raised terrace beds packed with perennials around a Cecile Brunner rose-covered arbor make the Larkin House garden the closest Monterey stand-in for the hidden oasis of Francis Hodgson Burnett's 1910 children's classic novel. A picturesque single-room stone-faced adobe structure occupied in 1847 by Lieutenant Sherman, the future Civil War general and protagonist of the Yellow Rose fable, is a favorite subject for photographers. Massachusetts-born store owner and trader Thomas Larkin built his two-story adobe in 1835. He combined local redwood timber and sun-dried adobe bricks to design a house featuring wide balconies, a long covered porch, and exaggerated eaves to protect the walls from weathering. Synthesizing elements from Southwest and East Coast cultures, Larkin's home became the prototype for the popular Monterey colonial architectural style of the early 20th century. In 1845, Secretary of State James Buchanan requested Larkin to serve as a confidential agent of the U.S. government. Today we'd call that a spy, and to assist any move of succession from Mexico. The first American to greet the invading Commodore Sloat in 1846, he helped draft the Proclamation of Annexation. He also played a key role at the first California Constitutional Convention. A gate in the western wall of his garden opens to Pacific Street and Colton Hall, where delegates met to sign the document in 1849. This next postcard of Colton Hall is California Historical Landmark number 126, and is located on Pacific Street here in Monterey. And this postcard was printed about 1902. And this is actually the site where the California Constitution was negotiated in 1849. Appointed alcalde, that's mayor, judge, tax collector of Monterey, after the U.S. seized California in 1846, Navy chaplain Walter Colton set out to build a town hall and a schoolhouse. He financed the property by taxing sinful malefactors, including gamblers, liquor store owners, and inebriated citizens. Serious offenders he sentenced to terms of construction labor, and when completed in 1849, visitors hailed Colton Hall as the largest and most impressive public building west of the Mississippi. The Constitution document, drafted in this building, featured progressive articles on suffrage, women's property rights, prohibition of slavery, and a requirement that all laws be published in both English and Spanish. When open to the public, the upper floor museum displays long tables scattered with quill pens and unfinished documents, as if just discarded by delegates during a break in negotiation. An attached single-story, solid granite block building served until 1956 as the city jail. Each of the dark, heavily barred cells on display contains sleeping cots, guitars, and artifacts associated with real and fictional inmates. Recreating a scene from Steinbeck's Tortilla Flat, Danny's cell portrays a blanket-covered figure huddled on a bunk. Colton Hall is the only city building set in expensive grounds. We can rest here for a few minutes to enjoy the front lawn featuring a large bronze mother grizzly bear tending her cub, and 35 metal plaques set in a brick pathway leading to the main entrance note significant periods in Monterey history. Beginning with recognition of Native Americans as the ancient ones, they progressed through Chinese fishermen, 1851, the artists of Bohemian Monterey, 1874, and Italian fishermen from 1875, to the Hotel del Monte that in 1850 galvanized Monterey's role as a world-class tourist destination. Our next postcard of the Old Custom House. This is California Historical Landmark number 1. It's located on the Custom House Plaza overlooking the wharf. And the postcard actually dates, the postcard carries the date 1814, but historians date the building from 1827. After winning independence from Spain, Mexico opened the new nation to international trade. Built on the ocean front in 1827, the Custom House collected taxes on all trade and cargo transactions within California. As business expanded, the building doubled in size with a second story and a wide porch veranda. According to a national park website, a single vessel involved in California's hide and tallow trade might owe $5,000 to $25,000 in duty fees on just one cargo load. Custom fees comprised California's most important source of revenue during the 19th century. Commodore Sloat raised the U.S. flag on this spot when he seized the province in 1846. Recognizing this historic role and its service as the first government building on the West Coast in 1900, local citizens began one of the first restoration projects on a public building in the state. In 1929, the old Custom House became California Historic Landmark No. 1. Today it houses a museum and a gift shop featuring Monterey-themed books, cards, games, maritime merchandise at the entrance to the Fisherman's Wharf Pier. This next picture is not actually a postcard. It's a photograph of the Monterey mural by Guillermo Wagner Granzio that was completed in 1983. A 1960s urban renewal project routed the coastal highway alongside the harbor underneath a new Custom House plaza and built a hotel and conference center aimed at simulating tourism. This 45-foot-long glazed tile mosaic is mounted on the rear wall of the center and tells the story of Monterey in stylized vignettes, from Native Americans to the denizens of Cannery Row. You can absorb this entertaining visual presentation of history and less than half a mile away stand on the slopes where it all began. So next we move along to the Lower Presidio Park. The postcard here shows a view of the fishing fleet in Monterey Harbor about 1920 from that park. A neglected corner of weeds and willows lining a culvert at the entrance to the Lower Presidio Park is the site of the Vizcaino Oak. Although listed as the location of California Historical Landmark number 128, the landing place of Sebastian Vizcaino and Fray Junipero Serra, there is no traditional bronze marker. A small plaque on a weathered rock does commemorate Portola's founding of Monterey, and an incongruous Celtic stone cross dedicated to Serra stands a few yards away. Neither conveys the significance of a site described by some as the Plymouth Rock of the West Coast. A short walk up the hill, and we enter a city park with panoramic views over Monterey Bay and the harbor. The upper slopes are home to the U.S. Army Presidio of Monterey. The city leases the lower section for public recreation. At the center of the park, the Presidio Museum of Monterey tells the story of its military heritage. This land served as a sacred site for countless generations of indigenous people. A large rounded boulder known as the Rain Rock protrudes from the grassy slope. Multiple holes ground into the rock indicate it may have served a ceremonial purpose, possibly to influence the weather. Two interpretive panels lining a walkway overlooking the harbor describe the lifestyles of the local tribe. One depicts their willow and tule thatched dwellings. Another includes an extract from the Esalen and Rumsian creation story. The next panel along the walk tells the story of Captain Hippolyte Bouchard, a Frenchman loyal to the newly free nation of Argentina, who was authorized as a privateer to plunder ships and ports of the former colonial master, the King of Spain. In November 1818, Bouchard sailed two armed vessels with a force of 400 men into Monterey Bay. He demanded the surrender of your city with all the furniture and other belongings of the king. If you do not do so, the city will be reduced to cinders, he threatened. Bouchard landed troops near Pacific Grove and attacked from the rear, but by then the inhabitants had evacuated inland to safety. For 6 days, the flag of Argentina flew over Monterey Peninsula. Unable to find any civilians to convert to the anti-Spanish cause, Bouchard looted and set fire to vacant buildings, but departed empty-handed. Additional panels accompany a life-size granite sculpture of Serra. erected in 1891 by Jane Stanford of Stanford University. After Pope John Paul II canonized Sarah as a saint in 2015, someone who sympathized with the suffering the cleric inflicted on the native inhabitants decapitated the statue. After being found on the beach several years later, his severed head and body are once again reunited. In this final stretch of our tour, we'll walk up a steep but accessible paved path from the museum to the remains of Fort Mervin, the first American fort on the West Coast. This site is marked at the top of the ridge by a triangular earthen mound and several ancient cannons aiming out over the bay. Nearby, large quarried blocks inscribed with the names of funding groups form the basis of a towering monument to Commander Sloat. The 1906 earthquake destroyed a statue of Sloat intended by the architects to crown the edifice. Short of funds and time, the builders replaced the figure with a crouching granite eagle. Their solution generated an unfortunate pairing. The stance of the bird conflicts with the proportions of its base, resulting in a sad, drooping appearance. This melancholy presentation of our national icon perfectly matches the sorrow that hangs over Monterey on the cancellation of the city's grand 250th birthday. Well, thank you for listening to my story today. This was originally published on a website on medium.com under the title A Virtual Tour in 9 Postcards. If you'd like to read the original text and look at the photographs again, you can go to the Monterey 250-year website, www.monterey.org/250years, and on there is a link to A Virtual Tour in 9 Postcards by David Laws. Thank you again for listening.